Across the blazing heart of the Mediterranean, in the summer of 1565, the world witnessed a battle so enormous, so brutal, and so impossible that even today it feels like legend more than history. This was the Great Siege of Malta, a clash where an island no larger than a whisper stood against the largest empire on earth. It was a war of faith, pride, revenge, iron, blood, and destiny. The mighty Ottoman Empire, unstoppable for centuries, arrived with tens of thousands of elite soldiers, cannons the size of houses, war fleets that covered horizons, and commanders convinced that nothing on Malta could survive their power. Their goal was simple: crush the Knights Hospitaller, tear Christianity from the Central Sea, and open a gateway to Europe itself. But what happened next shocked the entire world. The defenders were not an enormous army. They were a patchwork of knights, Maltese villagers, fishermen, stoneworkers, farmers, and young boys too small to hold swords. They had almost no food, barely any water, collapsing walls, and weapons older than their fathers. Yet they fought like warriors possessed, shielding their homes with flesh, building fortress walls out of dead comrades, repelling attacks that should have erased them in minutes. The siege dragged on for months. Fire naval battles across blood-red waters. Fire night raids in burning streets. Fire cannons shaking cities to dust. Fire fires turning towns into ashes. Fire disease destroying armies. Fire starvation carving human souls. Fire ghost stories haunting trenches. Fire final battles fought on piles of corpses. And somehow, unbelievably, Malta did not fall. The Knights and Maltese held their ground until the sea itself delivered salvation. Sicilian reinforcements arrived, and the great Ottoman war machine finally broke apart and fled. The Great Siege of Malta became one of the most dramatic underdog victories in global history. Across the blazing heart of the Mediterranean, in the summer of 1565, the world witnessed a battle so enormous, so brutal, and so impossible that even today it feels like legend more than history. This was the Great Siege of Malta, a clash where an island no larger than a whisper stood against the largest empire on earth. It was a war of faith, pride, revenge, iron, blood, and destiny. The mighty Ottoman Empire, unstoppable for centuries, arrived with tens of thousands of elite soldiers, cannons the size of houses, war fleets that covered horizons, and commanders convinced that nothing on Malta could survive their power. Their goal was simple: crush the Knights Hospitaller, tear Christianity from the Central Sea, and open a gateway to Europe itself. But what happened next shocked the entire world. The defenders were not an enormous army. They were a patchwork of knights, Maltese villagers, fishermen, stoneworkers, farmers, and young boys too small to hold swords. They had almost no food, barely any water, collapsing walls, and weapons older than their fathers. Yet they fought like warriors possessed, shielding their homes with flesh, building fortress walls out of dead comrades, repelling attacks that should have erased them in minutes. The siege dragged on for months. Fire naval battles across blood-red waters. Fire night raids in burning streets. Fire cannons shaking cities to dust. Fire fires turning towns into ashes. Fire disease destroying armies. Fire starvation carving human souls. Fire ghost stories haunting trenches. Fire final battles fought on piles of corpses. And somehow, unbelievably, Malta did not fall. The Knights and Maltese held their ground until the sea itself delivered salvation. Sicilian reinforcements arrived, and the great Ottoman war machine finally broke apart and fled. The Great Siege of Malta became one of the most dramatic underdog victories in global history. So welcome to History Teller YT, where today you are not just going to hear another timeline. You will feel the shock of cannon fire, smell battlefield smoke, walk the streets of burning Burgu, cry with families who refuse surrender, and stand beside warriors who change the path of civilization. Stay with this story. It will pull you deeper than you expect. This is not just history. This is survival. This is fate. This is Malta. Still, every man, woman, and child on the island poured their strength into turning Malta into an immovable fortress. Fort St. Elmo, the smallest but most exposed stronghold, lay on the tip of Mount Sybaris, guarding the mouth of the Grand Harbor. Its walls were thick, made from the limestone that Malta itself grew from, and though small, it formed a gate between the Ottoman approach and the Knights' essential naval sanctuary. Fort St. Angelo stood at Burgu, immense and ancient, bristling with cannons. Opposite Burgu, the new town of Sanglia rose like a peninsula of stone. It was a forest of half-built houses, ramparts, towers, and sharpened stakes. Between these two headlands would flow the blood and smoke of a long siege. Inside the walls, the order reorganized its limited manpower. The knights themselves numbered around 500 elite warriors, but they were only the tip of the spear. Behind them stood several thousand Maltese militia, hardened farmers and fishermen ready to kill for their homeland. There were Spanish arquebusiers, proven mercenaries from Italy, and companies of adventurers who sought glory. Yet for all this, the defenders barely totaled 6,000 men, against an expected Ottoman invasion force at least 10 times their size. This terrifying imbalance did not shatter morale. It hardened it. Valette required every household to store months of grain and water. The wells were isolated behind inner defenses, so that even if outer walls fell, thirst would not break them quickly. Powder magazines were sealed beneath rock chambers. Priests cataloged ammunition, medical supplies, cloth strips for bandages, lamp oil for night fighting, and religious icons intended to strengthen spirits. The knights worked their galleys, using them as mobile gun platforms within the harbor. If the Ottomans attempted to rush the water, they would face a wall of cannon fire. Still, beneath the surface ran fear. Malta had no forests, no deep rivers, and little farmland. Should the siege drag into months, starvation would stalk every street. Soldiers whispered that if Sicily did not send reinforcements in time, Malta would become a tomb. Messengers were dispatched in secret convoys across the sea to Naples, Palermo, and Rome. They carried desperate pleas for soldiers, for cannons, for powder, and for ships. The Pope listened attentively. Spain hesitated. Italy debated. All wanted Malta to hold, but none wished to weaken their own defenses. Meanwhile, the Maltese people themselves made preparations often overlooked in grand histories. Women stitched clothing for soldiers, storing spools of thread and fabric in cellars, knowing uniforms would be shredded by gunfire and rubble. Children collected stones to be used as improvised ammunition from rooftops. Blacksmiths reshaped metal into crude spearheads. Fishermen stored nets, not for catching fish, but to tangle Ottoman grappling hooks that might scale walls during night assaults. Every night, bonfires flickered across the hills. They were signals. If Ottoman sails were sighted, the entire island would awaken within minutes. Very few slept peacefully, but many slept with a strange confidence. On Malta, faith was thicker than fear. Priests preached that they were living through a biblical trial, chosen by God to withstand the empire of the Crescent. They quoted scripture during drills and sermons, stirring soldiers with images of ancient heroes and martyrs. In these weeks before the siege, Malta became a crucible, hot, pressurized, and waiting. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings as it swept salt through the narrow streets of Burgu. Islanders said the sea smelled different, that gulls flew inland rather than toward the waves, and that perhaps heaven itself sensed the coming storm. No one doubted the invasion would happen. The only mystery was when and how many Ottoman banners would rise against the sunrise. While Malta transformed itself into a bastion of stone and fire, the Ottoman Empire prepared an armada so vast that European chroniclers later described it as a floating continent. In the shipyards of Istanbul, Gallipoli, Alexandria, Algiers, and Tunis, hundreds of galleys creaked against their moorings. Shipwrights soaked planks in pitch, hammered nails with relentless rhythm, and caulked hulls until they gleamed black beneath the Mediterranean sun. The air rang with the smell of tar, sweat, wood chips, and iron. The sea itself felt smaller at the sight of so many hulls floating side by side. At the heart of this naval giant stood three men, each with their own ambitions and rivalries. Mustafa Pasha, veteran general and siege master, served as overall commander of the land forces. Piali Pasha commanded the fleet, a man of skill and pride, jealous of his authority. The third figure, and perhaps the most frightening, was Turgut Reis, called Dragut by Europeans, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean. A genius of naval warfare, Dragut had humiliated Christian fleets for decades, raiding coasts, capturing towns, and sinking ships with chilling brilliance. Suleiman considered him irreplaceable. Within Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, Suleiman the Magnificent made final arrangements. Though advanced in age and plagued by illness, he insisted the campaign proceed. In his council chambers hung large maps: Malta, Sicily, Tunisia, and the Italian peninsula. His advisors urged caution. Many remembered Rhodes, where the knights had resisted for months before departing as heroes. But pride and strategy outweighed hesitation. Malta had become a symbol of Ottoman humiliation, and symbols mattered as much as territory. "This island," Suleiman reportedly said, "is a chain across my sea. Remove it." The army assembled was unprecedented. Around 30,000 elite troops, janissaries bearing matchlock muskets, spies loaded with curved sabers, engineers trained in sapping tunnels, and artillery units transporting colossal bronze cannons heavy enough to crush city walls into dust. Accompanying them were tens of thousands of sailors, camp followers, slave rowers, supply crews, cooks, masons, and scribes. Arab auxiliaries, Berber corsairs, Egyptian regiments, Albanian musketeers, Greek labor battalions, and Syrian logisticians merged into one juggernaut. The empire moved like a vast machine powered by faith and ambition. When final preparations were complete, the fleet unfurled crimson sails adorned with crescents and calligraphic prayers. As the ships slid across the Bosporus toward open sea, witnesses reported the water churning beneath was like storm waves. Cannons boomed ceremonial salutes. Drums thundered. Priests chanted verses from the Quran. Trumpets announced to Istanbul's citizens that the greatest naval force since antiquity was leaving to erase the nights. The spectacle made mothers weep, children cheer, and aged veterans salute with trembling hands. But beneath the grandeur lay tension. Mustafa Pasha distrusted Piali Pasha, believing naval command should not override military necessity. Piali, in turn, despised Mustafa's arrogance. Dragut, not yet present but expected to join later, was respected by both and feared. These rivalries would later shape the siege as much as cannon fire. The fleet first headed toward the island of Rhodes, the knights' old home, as if to mock their past defeat. Then it turned westward, hugging the Anatolian coast before crossing to the Greek islands. Rumors outran the ships. Italian merchants claimed the sea had been blackened by sails. Spanish diplomats warned that Sicily and Naples must prepare for invasion. Venetian traders debated whether Europe should help the knights or quietly hope the Ottomans and Spain would weaken each other. As days passed, fishermen spotted the fleet from a distance. They described it like a moving wall upon the water, blotting out the horizon. The Mediterranean, normally dotted with sails and merchant routes, turned silent. Many coastal cities barred their ports, fearing raids. Malta sent scouts into the sea lanes, but none returned with good news. Then, on May 18, 1565, the Armada appeared off the Maltese coast. Like shadows cast by a burning sky, hundreds of ships came into view, tall masts swaying, banners snapping, drums echoing through the salt wind. Malta, so small compared to this floating empire, braced for the hammer of history. The siege had begun. Long before the Ottomans fired a single cannon shot, their presence alone weighed upon Malta like a nightmare pressing against a waking mind. As dawn broke over the sea, Maltese sentries stationed at Fort St. Elmo saw dark shapes on the horizon. Specks at first, then rows, then ranks, and finally the unmistakable silhouettes of enemy galleys. They sounded the alarm. Bells rang wildly. Priests shouted prayers. The city of Burgu erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers sprinted to their posts. Children were ushered into caves and underground shelters. Women formed water lines to the battlements. Valette himself hurried to the harbor walls to watch the armada unfold. The sight defied imagination. Ottoman banners, crimson and gold, fluttered from hundreds of masts. The rhythmic thud of oars striking the sea reached the shore like an approaching heartbeat. Cannons glinted beneath the rising sun. The wind carried the smell of pitch and sweat across the water. European chroniclers later wrote that Malta seemed to shrink beneath that vision. Not because of physical size, but because human beings cannot help feeling small before unstoppable force. Yet the knights did not tremble. They raised their flags, the white 8-pointed cross of the order. Priests chanted hymns. Soldiers loaded muskets. Cannons aimed at the sea. Valette stood tall, robes whipping in the wind, whispering to his captains that this day would be remembered in heaven and hell. But war is never quiet. Ottoman galleys approached the southern coast, near Marsaxlok Bay, searching for landing sites. They needed a beach shallow enough to unload horses, artillery, and thousands of troops. The Maltese coast offered few such places, but the invaders had excellent intelligence. They knew every inlet, every slope, every weakness. Scouts had disguised themselves for years as merchants, sailors, even fishermen to study the island. Malta had been under Ottoman observation long before their ships appeared. The first landing attempts came with brutal speed. Scores of galleys surged forward, ramming their hulls into the sand. Janissaries leapt into the surf, muskets raised overhead. Behind them came cannon crews, pulling wheels through the water with ropes. The knights greeted them with musket fire from distant cliffs, bullets slamming into wooden shields and painted armor. The Ottomans answered with rocket arrows and heavy arquebus volleys, forcing the defenders to retreat toward fortified positions. Within hours, thousands of Ottoman troops controlled the beach. Engineers erected earthworks for artillery. Tents spread like a carpet across the plains. Piali Pasha inspected the horizon through golden optics. Mustafa Pasha kinev impuriv. They believed Malta would fall swiftly, but Valette had predicted this landing zone. He did not waste men in futile resistance along open beaches. Instead, he concentrated his strength behind stone, the walls of Burgu, Sunglia, and Fort St. Elmo. He understood something the Ottomans had not yet realized. Malta was not a battlefield. Malta was a trap. To take the island, the invaders would have to crush the strongest fortifications in Europe, one by one, under punishing heat, under ceaseless gunfire, against defenders who preferred death to defeat. As night fell on that first day, the sea glimmered with moonlight reflecting off hundreds of anchored ships. Campfires burned across the Ottoman encampment. Drums echoed into the dark. Inside the city walls, the knights passed bread, water, and wine, speaking quietly about tomorrow. They knew battle would begin at sunrise. Valette walked the ramparts alone, touching the walls, whispering to them as if they were living soldiers. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for endurance. Because victory, he understood, belonged not to the stronger army, but to the army that did not break first. And so the Great Siege of Malta truly began, with silent stars watching above, and two civilizations preparing to collide with unimaginable violence. Before the Ottoman cannons fired their first iron shot at the limestone of Fort St. Elmo, every commander on both sides understood one truth. The fall or survival of this small fortress would determine the destiny of Malta. It was positioned on the very edge of the Grand Harbor, perched on the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula like a stone dagger pointed toward the sea. Though comparatively small and isolated from the main defensive hub at Burgu and Sunglia, St. Elmo possessed an authority beyond its size. It was Malta's gatekeeper. Whoever controlled St. Elmo controlled entry into the twin harbors, the central lifeline of the Knights. These harbors sheltered their fleet, their supply routes from Sicily, and the emergency escape paths for civilians. For Valette, protecting St. Elmo was not merely tactical, it was symbolic. He believed that if even one wall fell too easily, Ottoman morale would soar, and Europe might believe the knights doomed. Thus, before battle even began, St. Elmo became holy ground, a shrine fortified with sweat, stone, gunpowder, and prayer. He ordered the strongest artillery to overlook the fort from Fort St. Angelo and from Sunglia across the water. He reinforced the garrison inside the small fortress with knights from Spain, Italy, Portugal, and France. Elite warriors with bloodlines of nobility and reputations for valor. Although many seasoned officers argued that St. Elmo should be abandoned to consolidate manpower at Burgu, Valette refused. He believed that Malta must bleed slowly, not instantly. Every day, St. Elmo survived would buy precious time for Sicily to react, plan, and sail reinforcements. The Ottomans recognized the same strategic equation, but from opposite reasoning. Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha understood that as long as St. Elmo stood, their galleys could not enter the Grand Harbor. Without this harbor, Ottoman naval supremacy meant nothing. Their artillery could not be landed close to the knights' strongholds, and their smaller vessels would remain exposed to counterattack. St. Elmo was like a cork sealing a bottle. Until it was removed, the Ottomans could not drink victory. Thus, even before Ottoman boots touched Maltese soil, they had agreed on a first objective: destroy Fort St. Elmo. Mustafa believed this would take only a few days, perhaps a week at most. After all, St. Elmo was lightly walled, small, and set apart from Valette's main body of troops. Ottoman intelligence predicted a swift collapse and an easy triumph. Their cannons, enormous bronze beasts dragged across beaches and rocks by teams of slaves and oxen, were positioned to pound St. Elmo from both land and sea. Yet what no Ottoman map showed, and what no spy reported, was the emotional weight the knights would place upon this fort. They saw St. Elmo as Rhodes reborn. They saw enemy ambition and answered with crusading pride. They believed that if they died upon those walls, history would echo their names for centuries. The defenders prayed loudly and sang hymns before sunrise drills. They sharpened pikes, cleaned muskets, oiled armor, and carved holy symbols into their shields. Many knights wrote farewell letters to family members in Europe, understanding the odds. Many burned those letters afterward, deciding destiny needed no final goodbye. Even Malta's geography itself favored drama. St. Elmo sat exposed to punishing sunlight, whipping sea winds, and narrow approaches. To supply the garrison demanded nightly boat runs across harbor waters under darkness, beneath sniper fire and flaming arrows. Every crate of gunpowder delivered required courage. Every wounded knight ferried away risked drowning or enemy fire. Still, morale held. St. Elmo's men believed themselves equal to ancient heroes. They trained in sword drills while cannons tested ranges overhead. They blessed their cannons with holy water. When the Ottomans gathered across the bay, thousands of sails and banners shimmering under sunlight, the knights responded by ringing every church bell in Burgu. The echo rolled down the harbor like thunder, declaring to the invader, "Here we stand." And so, while peace still hung like mist over the water, both armies stared at St. Elmo and understood that the fate of the Great Siege would begin with this tiny fragment of stone. The arrival of the Ottoman Engineering Corps marked the transformation of Malta from a rocky island into a brutal workshop of war. In the middle decades of the 16th century, the Mediterranean Sea held within its tides more than saltwater and merchant vessels. It held the pulsing heart of global conflict. The sea was not merely a vast body of water between continents, but the superhighway of empires, faiths, and ideologies. Two civilizations, Christian Europe and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, watched each other across the blue expanse with suspicion sharpened into hostility. Everything about this era was shaped by the massive tidal wave of Ottoman expansion. Constantinople had fallen a century earlier, shocking Europe. In the time since, the Ottoman Empire had swallowed Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Egypt, Algeria, Syria, Palestine, and huge stretches of Hungary. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their fleets ruled the waves, and their cannons shattered fortress walls across continents. Europe, fragmented into rival kingdoms and duchies, trembled at their power. Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Francis I of France, Philip II of Spain, and the papacy itself all maneuvered, schemed, and prayed, sometimes against the Ottomans, sometimes even against each other. Into this storm existed a peculiar and remarkable military order, the Knights Hospitaller. Known originally as a religious hospital group in Jerusalem centuries earlier, they had survived crusades, relocations, defeats, and rebirths. They once held the island of Rhodes until they were forced out after a heroic last stand in 1522 by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Europe believed they would fade into memory, but instead, King Charles V granted them the barren, small, rocky archipelago of Malta. Malta was hot, dry, windswept, lacking trees and fertile soil, but it held something extraordinary, a strategic location between Sicily and North Africa. Whoever ruled Malta could disrupt trade, pirate shipping routes, and block Ottoman expansion westward. The Knights, understanding the value more than anyone, transformed the island into their fortress home. They were fewer than 10,000 residents in total. Knights, local Maltese, mercenaries, priests, and farmers. But they were united by a profound belief in divine duty. They lived as monks who carried swords, men who prayed before battle, and warriors who carved stone ramparts under the scorching Mediterranean sun. Malta was more than territory, it was a symbol. The Knights saw themselves as the last true crusaders in Europe, guardians of the Christian sea routes, and defenders of the faith. They raided Ottoman shipping, freed Christian slaves, and turned captured ships into additions to their tiny fleet. Their presence infuriated Istanbul. Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of the Ottomans, was deeply aware of Malta. The defeat at Rhodes decades earlier had been a personal scar. He had spared the Knights then, allowing them safe departure, believing they would never again trouble his empire. But now, in their new rocky island base, they were harassing his maritime power and humiliating his prestige. He resolved to erase them. Behind this decision lay not only rage, but strategy. Malta stood like a sharp nail in Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. Remove it, and the path to the Western Sea, the same route that reached Italy and Rome, would open. The Pope feared that if Malta fell, the Ottomans would have a springboard to invade Sicily and eventually southern Europe. In taverns, in palaces, in churches, and port cities from Venice to Madrid, rumors spread. The Turks are coming. Europe prepared for the worst, but it also hesitated. The Protestant Reformation had shattered previously united Christendom. Catholics and Protestants mistrusted each other almost as much as they mistrusted the Ottomans. France cooperated with Istanbul. England was undergoing religious upheaval. Spain was overburdened with wars and finances. As Suleiman planned, Europe stalled. On Malta, the Knights built ever stronger walls, not knowing if help would come. It was a time when the future of nations, religions, and the Mediterranean balance hung by a thread, ready to snap in thunderous war. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was not merely a regional power, it was a global titan. Its wealth came from trade routes stretching from Vienna to Baghdad, from Mecca to the shores of Algeria. In Istanbul, architects raised mosques of breathtaking beauty, poets composed verses of love and heroism, scholars debated laws, and soldiers drilled endlessly. It was the golden age of Ottoman might. Suleiman himself ruled not only as emperor, but as caliph, head of Islam in the eyes of many. His armies were among the best trained in the world. His artillery corps pioneered large-scale siege warfare. Ottoman cannons breached walls that medieval kings once believed indestructible. However, for Suleiman, greatness required dominance of both land and sea. The Mediterranean was the empire's western frontier. Its control meant access to the Atlantic, Italy, and even the New World. To ensure this dream, Suleiman nurtured a navy built by the most feared corsairs and admirals of the era. Names like Hayreddin Barbarossa echoed across Europe like thunder. These men, once pirates themselves, commanded fleets larger than entire European navies. Their galleys prowled the waves with unmatched speed. Their boarding parties swarmed enemy ships like storms of blades and fire. Ottoman fleets raided Spanish coasts, burned Italian ports, and brought back thousands of Christian captives to be sold as slaves. Despite all this success, Malta remained a thorn. The Knights Hospitaller not only harassed Ottoman shipping, they humiliated it. Their daring raids on merchant convoys, their liberation of Christian slaves, and the ransom of Ottoman sailors became a source of laughter in European courts and rage in Istanbul. Every raid eroded Suleiman's claim to complete mastery of the Mediterranean. At age 70, the Sultan felt time slipping from his grasp. His physicians whispered of frailty, his advisors recommended caution, but his pride demanded action. So the plan was forged: invade Malta, annihilate the Knights, shatter their fortresses, and use the island as a stepping stone into Christian Europe. The fleet would be colossal. More than 200 ships, thousands of janissaries, elite Turkish infantry trained from childhood, artillery that could reduce stone to dust, engineers who could bury fortresses beneath tunnels and explosives, and auxiliaries from across the empire. The irony was that Christianity itself was divided enough to clear the path. Had Europe united early, the invasion might never have sailed. Instead, Suleiman prepared with confidence. Yet the knights were not blind. Jean Parisot de Valette, Grand Master of the Order, understood Ottoman ambitions like few others. Valette was 71, weathered by decades of naval war, scarred from battles against corsairs, and as cunning as any admiral alive. His knowledge of the Ottoman world came not only from battle, but from captivity. He had once been chained as a galley slave under Turkish whips. That memory fueled him with burning resolve. Under his leadership, Malta became a fortress pointed like a spear toward the east, daring the empire to come. As the Ottoman navy hammered timbers into hulls, forged cannonballs, and trained troops, Malta's villagers carried stones up steep hillsides to build walls thicker than houses. Priests prayed as laborers sweated under the sun. Every harbor echoing with hammer blows was a reminder that destiny was approaching. Both sides felt it. The Mediterranean was pregnant with war, and its birth would shake history. To understand why the Knights Hospitaller fought with such desperation, one must understand what they believed themselves to be. They were more than soldiers. They were heirs to a crusading lineage stretching back 400 years. Their vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, bound them as monks, while their swords bound them as warriors. Their order was international, drawing noble sons from Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, England, and the German principalities. Many had trained since childhood in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and naval warfare. They spoke multiple languages, prayed daily, studied theology, and believed that martyrdom in battle against the enemies of Christ ensured eternal reward. The people of Malta shared this fervor in their own way. Though not members of the order, the islanders were fiercely loyal. They farmed rocky land, fished dangerous waters, and built their homes around bastions and towers for protection. Their world was harsh. Their island was wind-beaten, dry, and barren, yet they loved it deeply. They had endured raids, piracy, famine, and disease. Now they faced their greatest trial. The Ottoman fleet was a floating city of war about to descend upon their shores. For the Maltese, survival meant resistance. If Malta fell, they would not merely be conquered, they would be enslaved or killed. Their determination ignited as brightly as the knights' crusading zeal. Religion, politics, identity, and survival blended into a single cause. Priests preached that Malta stood as God's chosen battleground. Churches held mass prayer vigils. Children helped carry stones to reinforce walls. Women prepared food for soldiers and stored water inside cellars. The island braced itself like a clenched fist. Valette gave fiery speeches, declaring that the knights must either triumph in glory or perish. He believed there was no escape, no surrender, and no bargaining with Suleiman's armies. His message did not falter, even in the darkest hours ahead. We are the shield of Christendom. Malta is the wall between the infidel and Europe. Break here, and Europe will burn. The Venetian ambassador wrote that European morale depended entirely on Malta. Diplomats whispered that if the Ottomans captured the island, Rome itself might tremble beneath Ottoman cannons within a decade. So before a single cannon sounded, before one musket fired, before the first landing craft scraped Maltese sand, the stakes had already risen beyond territory. Malta was destiny. Malta was survival. Malta was faith. When news spread that the Ottoman Armada had raised sail from Istanbul, winged by hundreds of oars, the knights gathered in their chapel. They prayed, wept, confessed sins, and took communion. They knew most would die, but they also knew their deaths would echo through centuries. Their vow was simple: we hold Malta, or Malta holds our graves. The drums of war had begun. As the first whispers of the Ottoman invasion reached Malta, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette knew the Knights Hospitaller faced the most overwhelming threat in their long, blood-stained history. From the high ridges of Burgu and Sanglia, where ancient limestone walls clung to the shoreline like claws, Valette watched shipbuilders hammer and soldiers drill. Malta's coastline was jagged, full of coves where enemy vessels might land troops. If the Ottomans secured a beachhead, they could bring artillery, cut supply lines, and slowly strangle the defenders. That knowledge drove Valette daily. He ordered inspections at dawn, noon, evening, even in the dead of night. The Knights' fortifications, although impressive for their time, were never designed to resist the full might of Suleiman the Magnificent. They would take St. Elmo, even if it meant burying every defender and sacrificing thousands of soldiers. Mustafa demanded an escalated assault. Piali ordered the ship's position closer. Engineers began planning controlled mines beneath the walls, and snipers doubled fire. The stage was set for massacre. The most brutal hours of the siege were not always daylight bombardments nor major assaults. They were the nights between battles, when darkness covered Malta like a heavy cloak and men clung to sanity with trembling hands. In those hours, the roar of cannon ceased, but the war continued in a slower, more intimate language. Whispers, screams, blades scraping in shadows, and prayers echoing across the harbor. Inside St. Elmo, night never meant rest. Men slept in torn shifts, leaning against ruined walls, too afraid to lie down fully in case debris fell or surprise attack occurred. They slept with muskets across their knees and daggers tucked in side belts. Fires were forbidden because flames revealed positions to Ottoman marksmen. So defenders moved through moonlit rubble like ghosts, eyes strained to distinguish shadow from enemy. The smell of death, sweet, rotten, metallic, hung perpetually in the air. Rats scurried over bodies to steel crumbs. Dogs howled across the harbor. The sea slapped rocks in rhythm like a heartbeat counting down to dawn. Night also brought desperate repair efforts. Engineers crawled along shattered walls, hammering stones into gaps, packing sandbags where masonry had fallen apart. To work under darkness, men used covered lanterns or touched hot metal to guide grip. Shattered guns were reforged using fire drums shielded from view. Wounded men lay nearby, offering advice or chanting prayers. Every task carried the weight of mortality. If repairs failed, the next day's assault would cut them down. Across the water, Ottoman troops also did not sleep easily. Their camps were a mixture of organized rigidity and restless energy. Janissaries rotated guard duty along trench lines, eyes fixed upon the black silhouette of St. Elmo. They watched flashes of torchlight inside the fort and wondered whether the defenders were repairing walls or preparing ambushes. Ottoman sappers crept forward at night to dig trenches closer to the bastions. Work was silent, shovels scraping dirt, breathing ragged, nerves stretched tight. If defenders heard them, musket fire erupted suddenly, killing men before they screamed. Sometimes night became chaos. On several occasions, Ottoman troops attempted silent raids. Wearing soft shoes, dark clothes, and blackened armor, they crossed trenches and climbed slopes, approaching the walls to plant scaling ladders. But St. Elmo's defenders had grown accustomed to reading the soundscape of war. They learned the difference between wind against stone and cloth against sand. When the Ottomans crept close, knights fired pistols downward, hurled stones, poured boiling oil or burning pitch, and swung pikes blindly into darkness. The screams of wounded raiders echoed across the harbor and haunted both armies. Equally terrifying were the Maltese counter-raids. Under Valette's direction, small groups crossed the harbor secretly at night to reinforce St. Elmo. These boats slid across black water in silence. If detected, they vanished under a storm of arrows and musket bullets, sinking with their crews. But many arrived successfully, and with them came ammunition, medical bandages, food, and whispered news from Burgos. Europe was preparing to help. Italy was mobilizing. Hope must not die. St. Elmo's defenders used night to send their own wounded away. It was agonizing. Men too injured to fight wept, begging to remain, ashamed of leaving brothers behind. Some refused evacuation and had to be dragged by force to waiting boats. When these wounded crossed the harbor and saw Burgos' towering walls lit by lanterns, many cried from relief and despair, knowing they would never again see St. Elmo alive. Night also magnified emotion. Men wrote their wills. They confessed sins. They remembered childhood memories they had forgotten for decades. They spoke about mothers, wives, sons, and daughters living far away in Europe, unaware that their loved ones were carving legends into Maltese stone. And they laughed, dark, trembling laughter, at jokes about death and heaven and the weight of armor. Humor became survival. Some nights were quiet enough that both sides could hear the other singing hymns. On one eerie occasion, knights chanting Latin psalms echoed across the harbor, answered by Ottoman warriors reciting Quranic verses beneath stars. For a strange moment, war paused, not in peace, but in recognition of shared humanity shaped by different truths. Then dawn arrived, cannons roared again, and whatever comfort night offered drowned instantly under fire. Days blended into nights, nights into days. St. Elmo shrank steadily, bleeding stone and men into the dust. But though walls crumbled, though bodies stacked at every corridor, St. Elmo still defied time. Valette understood now. The fort had outlived all reasonable expectations. It was no longer a fortress. It was a miracle. While Fort St. Elmo continued to fight beyond all reason, a whisper spread through the Ottoman camp, one that made exhausted soldiers lift their heads, straighten their backs, and stare eagerly toward the sea. That whisper carried a single name, Dragut. For months, rumors had promised his arrival. Now, scouts beginning at dawn claimed they saw black-sailed ships on the horizon, closing distance with frightening speed. Janissaries shouted to one another with excitement. Corsairs cheered. Even the frustrated Ottoman leadership, divided by ego and wounded pride, felt hope renewed. If any man alive could break the stalemate at Malta, everyone believed it was Dragut, master of war upon the waves, pirate lord, empire builder, and perhaps the most dreaded corsair to ever sail the Mediterranean. Dragut's reputation resembled myth more than biography. Born in a small village, he rose from modest beginnings to rule the sea with unmatched brilliance. Captured once by Genoese forces, he escaped slavery, swearing vengeance. Later, he served under Barbarossa, learning the highest arts of naval maneuvers and siege warfare. His victories became so numerous that Christians cursed his name during prayer. Mothers frightened unruly children by warning Dragut would steal them at night, and entire coastal towns fled inland when his sails appeared. To the Ottomans, he was not merely an admiral. He was a living instrument of destiny. For Mustafa Pasha, Dragut's arrival meant vindication. He believed the siege had stalled because he lacked the brilliant mind who understood European fortresses better than anyone. Piali Pasha, though fiercely proud, also welcomed Dragut reluctantly, knowing Ottoman naval authority needed his sharp intelligence. Even the Janissaries, whose discipline bordered on mechanical, murmured with excitement at the possibility that the siege would finally move forward. Yet beneath this energy pulsed a darker truth. Dragut's arrival also brought pressure. There would be no excuse for failure once the old corsair stepped ashore. He was famous for rewarding brilliance and punishing incompetence. Inside Fort St. Elmo, the defenders also heard rumors of Dragut's approach. Valette received word from spies that the corsair was on his way, reinforcing Ottoman strength. The news struck the knights like a hammer. Many remembered Dragut from naval battles across the Mediterranean. Some had lost ships to him. Some had lost brothers. They knew he would bring new artillery tactics, precise firing angles, and devastating battlefield psychology. A cruel joke spread across St. Elmo. Hell is sending reinforcements. Across the Mediterranean, Dragut's fleet had to fight brutal winds and supply shortages to reach Malta. Several ships nearly capsized in storms. Still, the corsair drove them forward without pause. He understood time was treasure. He believed the Ottomans had made a critical mistake by attacking St. Elmo first. But he also believed that captured fortresses did not need to be perfect victories. They needed to be fast victories. As Dragut's vessels drew near, Malta experienced a strange silence. Even the wind paused. Men who had spent weeks killing suddenly stood still and watched the sea turn black beneath the approaching sails. They sensed the arrival of a new chapter in the siege, one louder, bloodier, and far more complex. Dragut's first message to Mustafa and Piali was blunt. Prepare your ears. Cannon fire shall replace the beating of your hearts. And so, though St. Elmo still stood defiantly before Ottoman artillery, the stage was preparing to change in ways neither side imagined. This siege, already savage beyond reason, was about to transform into legend. Dragut stepped ashore to roaring cheers from thousands of warriors. His presence alone carried enough weight to alter the emotional atmosphere of the battlefield. He was no towering giant nor armored titan. In fact, Dragut was shorter than many Janissaries, his beard streaked with white, his weathered face marked by sea wind, scars, and exhaustion. But behind his eyes burned strategic genius. His soldiers knew it, his rivals feared it, and the knights across the harbor sensed it instantly. Dragut wasted no time in courtly greetings or empty ceremony. He demanded maps, terrain reports, construction documents, artillery charts, and trench measurements. He questioned officers ruthlessly, rejecting excuses or uncertainty. Mustafa attempted to explain the slow progress at St. Elmo, describing the strength of the defenders, the unforgiving topography, and the fierce commitment of the knights. Dragut interrupted, famously snapping, "You did not come to admire their courage. You came to break it." His tone silenced the tent. He walked the ridges overlooking St. Elmo with quick, sharp steps, studying the ruin. Ottoman cannons had done monstrous damage, but their firing angles were flawed. Many shots struck already ruined stone instead of fresh targets. He positioned naval guns farther along the bay, ordering them to target bastions not yet collapsed. Dragut's knowledge of wave heights, ship curvature, wind direction, and cannon recoil stunned sailors. Under his adjustments, Ottoman ships hit precise corners of St. Elmo that had remained untouched for days. Dragut then moved artillery from high ground to a lower position where they could fire directly into the fort's courtyard. His officers thought the idea insane. Barrels would need to be dragged through trenches under enemy fire. Dragut responded, "Then bleed while you drag." And they did. Crews hauled enormous guns across deadly ground, leaving bodies behind them. When the first cannonball fired from the new angle, smashing through inner walls the defenders believed safe, the morale of St. Elmo trembled for the first time. Dragut also ordered Ottoman sappers to tunnel beneath the walls. He instructed them to place explosive charges under the fort's heart, cracking its foundation. These tunnelers, Albanian miners, Persian engineers, and Arab diggers, labored under torchlight inside suffocating tunnels so narrow men had to crawl. Every thrust of a pickaxe risked discovery. Indeed, the knights heard faint echoes underground and detonated defensive charges, collapsing tunnels and killing dozens. Dragut ordered another attempt, then another. He knew that siege warfare required patience. Mustafa viewed Dragut with awe. Piali did not. Their rivalry, once simmering, now boiled. Piali resented Dragut's presence and accused Mustafa of worshipping the corsair too willingly. Dragut ignored both politicians. He cared only about results. On the battlefield, morale surged. Ottoman troops believed the siege would finally turn in their favor. The Janissaries, inspired, forced their trenches forward at lightning pace. Artillery thundered day and night. Knights fell in greater numbers. For every defender who died, Dragut believed he gained an inch of ground. Across the harbor, Valette watched with growing dread. He knew Dragut by reputation. The corsair never wasted moves. Every cannon shot now felt aimed by a master. The air smelled different. More smoke, more sulfur, more rage. St. Elmo's walls, already shattered, began collapsing faster than men could rebuild them. The defenders finally admitted something impossible just days earlier. We are entering the last chapter. Dragut had arrived, and Malta felt the world tilt. Though Dragut's arrival threatened to crush the knights completely, the siege of Malta carried unpredictable winds, and the most shocking twist emerged from the very fortress Dragut vowed to destroy. Despite Dragut's brilliance, the defenders of St. Elmo turned every inch of their fort into a weapon. They studied Ottoman firing patterns, predicted tunnel placements, and adjusted to Dragut's artillery strategy. They rewired cannon angles through rubble, aimed at Ottoman labor crews, and turned night raids into psychological torture. Dragut's men, working at insane speed, found themselves facing equal desperation. Dragut positioned himself frequently at the forward battery lines to personally aim cannons and direct trench movement, an act that inspired his soldiers but placed him in terrifying danger. He believed leadership required presence, not distance. He strode through gun smoke, giving direct orders, pointing, yelling, and measuring angles with ropes, carpenter sticks, and mathematical calculations scribbled in dust. Ottoman troops cheered at his courage, but the knights saw opportunity. On June 17th, 1565, Dragut stood near a forward artillery emplacement overlooking St. Elmo's interior. The bombardment had opened terrible wounds in the fort structure, and Ottoman troops prepared a full assault. Dragut, eager to refine the angle of naval fire, removed his helmet and leaned over a gun pit to inspect the harbor. At that very moment, a cannon fired from Fort St. Angelo, manned by Spanish gunners across the water, sent a single iron ball screaming across the harbor. It smashed in a stone near Dragut, shattering rock, blasting shards in all directions. One fragment struck Dragut violently in the head. He collapsed instantly. Shock rippled through the Ottoman lines. Commanders abandoned positions and rushed toward him. Soldiers whispered that the devil himself had fired the shot. Others claimed St. Elmo's stones were alive. Dragut was carried away bleeding, unconscious. His skull had been crushed. Ottoman surgeons fought to save him, cutting cloth, stitching wounds, chanting prayers, using herbs, pressing cold cloths, whispering that the empire needed him. But Dragut never regained speech. He muttered fragments of words, lost in delirium. On June 23rd, Dragut died. News spread in silence. No drums, no shouts, no cheers, only disbelief. Ottoman morale plunged as fast as artillery shells had once risen. The unstoppable genius, the hero of corsairs, the master of Mediterranean strategy, was dead. Mustafa Pasha ordered secrecy, fearing his men would break. But rumor outran truth. Soldiers whispered the fort was cursed. Some claimed angels defended St. Elmo. Others believed Suleiman himself had been punished for pride. In Fort St. Elmo, the The defenders did not know immediately. When Valette received confirmation days later, he thanked God with trembling voice. A spark of hope lit Europe. The impossible had happened. The greatest Ottoman strategist had fallen not in triumph, but in frustration, destroyed by defenders he believed doomed. But Dragut's death did not save St. Elmo. The walls could no longer stand. The courtyard swam with blood. Ammunition ran low. The garrison dwindled to skeleton numbers. Still, their sacrifice had bought a priceless miracle: time. Precious weeks were won, enough to change the entire future of the siege, enough to save Malta. Dragut died believing victory inevitable. History would prove him only half right. By the time June neared its end, Fort St. Elmo, once a proud bastion of limestone standing sharp against the Mediterranean sky, had transformed into a mangled carcass. Its walls shattered, its battlements erased, its inner courtyard filled with more blood than dust. Yet stunningly, incredibly, impossibly, it still stood. The defenders inside no longer recognized the fort from early sketches. They lived in an evolving ruin shaped each hour by explosions, rubble shifts, firestorms, and human resilience. Men who had arrived as noble knights looked now like desperate specters, hollow-eyed, unshaven, burned by sun and flame, wearing armor patched together with rope and cloth. But still they moved, still they loaded guns, still they prayed. Every dawn, when sunlight filtered through thick smoke and dust, the defenders braced for the same routine. Artillery hammering like a god pounding anvil against stone, trenches advancing, Ottoman musketeers peppering the air with iron shot, ship cannons blasting from the harbor, tunnels collapsing beneath the earth, and snipers waiting to kill any head that rose above a parapet. Every afternoon brought hotter air, making wounds rot faster and armor boil skin. These engineers, trained in geometry, ballistics, architectural mathematics, and tunnel operation, were the core of Ottoman siege doctrine. Using ropes, pulleys, levers, and manpower, they dragged enormous cannons across terrain that Europeans had claimed was impassable. Huge bronze artillery pieces, many taller than men and weighing several tons, were positioned on high ground facing St. Elmo. Their barrels were etched with patterns of roses and scriptural verses. Ottoman cannons were not merely tools of destruction. They were expressions of imperial power. To build the artillery platforms, engineers carved terraces into the hillsides. They used wooden beams stacked into makeshift scaffolding, layered with dirt to absorb recoil. Behind these batteries stood rows of ammunition wagons filled with cannonballs the size of pumpkins. Hundreds of slaves unloaded iron and stone shot, while powder crews carried barrels of black powder deep into trenches shielded by earthen walls. Every structure reflected meticulous planning, designed to reduce fatigue and maximize accuracy. Scorpion-like counterweight cranes swung into position, helping crews load shells efficiently. Ottoman observers later claimed that the siege batteries on Malta were the most complex engineering efforts the Mediterranean had seen since Roman times. Dragut, though not yet present, had sent instructions ahead. St. Elmo must be bombarded simultaneously from land and sea, denying defenders any safe angle. Mustafa Pasha, controlling the fleet, positioned galleys offshore. Their naval cannons, though smaller, offered crossfire. Ships angled themselves to strike St. Elmo's sea-facing walls, hoping to smash battlements and create breaches into the courtyard. Mustafa, however, insisted on land dominance. His infantry officers worked tirelessly to establish zigzag trenches creeping toward the fort, designs inspired by the siege traditions of Persia. These trenches protected advancing troops from direct gunfire. Engineers measured every curve, every ditch, every rampart height with mathematical precision. They built earthen parapets, gabion baskets filled with stones, and wooden mantlets, mobile shields on wheels that allowed musketeers to fire safely while advancing. From the slopes of Mount Sybaris, overseers watched the knights, observing them. Sometimes insults crossed the water, sarcastic challenges shouted through trumpets. Ottomans mocked the knights' dwindling numbers, while the knights answered with hymns sung defiantly. Across the waves, both armies studied each other like predators trying to read weakness. Within the Ottoman camps, daily life was a strange mixture of discipline, culture, superstition, and brutality. Camp kitchens roasted lamb over fires, coffee pots boiled, and scribes wrote letters describing the beauty of Maltese nature, even as soldiers prepared to destroy it. Janissaries trained relentlessly. Marching drills, musket maneuvers, hand-to-hand combat sequences. Commanders rotated troops to maintain stamina. Turkish doctors sharpened bone saws and needles. Imams recited prayers, assuring warriors that dying in this campaign promised paradise. Yet tension simmered between Mustafa and Piali. Mustafa demanded immediate frontal assault preparations, believing delays weakened momentum. Piali wanted to wait for Dragut's arrival, certain the great corsair's tactical brilliance would avoid costly losses. Their rivalry-fueled arguments so loud that soldiers outside their tents pretended not to hear words like fool and incompetent. Ottoman unity was powerful, but leadership friction would become a fracture line running through the entire siege. Still, their engineering progress was undeniable. After days of labor, artillery readiness had reached terrifying strength. Soldiers cleared fields of fire, chopped down trees for earthworks, and burned village houses around the harbor to prevent defenders from using them as cover. The Ottoman flag, red like fresh blood, flew high above the main battery. Drums echoed hourly, and with each beat, Fort St. Elmo became 1 minute closer to destruction. To the knights, watching these preparations was horrifying and awe-inspiring. They realized the Ottoman Empire had not come merely to conquer, but to erase. Yet not a single knight begged Valette to withdraw. Not one pleaded for mercy. They sharpened swords. They counted bullets. They knelt in prayer. And they whispered to each other that perhaps immortality awaited them beyond these walls. On the morning of May 24th, 1565, only 6 days after Ottoman landfall, the world exploded around Fort St. Elmo. At sunrise, Mustafa Pasha ordered the artillery to begin bombardment. The first cannon fired with a roar that shook dust from the cliffside and rattled windows miles away. A cloud of white smoke billowed outward, followed by a whistling scream as the cannonball hurtled across the harbor. It struck St. Elmo's outer wall with a thunderous crack, blasting limestone outward like fragments of bone. Knights rushed toward the breach, shielding their heads, shouting warnings, dragging debris aside, adjusting firing angles. It was the beginning of hell. Then more cannons fired, dozens. The sky trembled with vibration. Ground shook beneath boots. Waves splashed violently against the rocks from the shockwaves alone. Ottoman ships opened fire almost simultaneously, sending barges into the fort's vulnerable side. The air filled with smoke so thick that defenders coughed and wiped soot from their eyes. They could not even see the attackers through the gray haze. The sound never stopped. It was not a volley, but a continuous stream of thunder, hour after hour, stone after stone collapsing. Valette, watching from St. Angelo across the harbor, felt his heart twist. Artillery specialists reported the bombardment was far heavier than predicted. Ottoman cannonballs were smashing through bastions faster than engineers could repair. The fort's walls, already old and exposed, cracked deeply. Dust clouds rose like volcanic eruptions. But even as the walls shattered, the knights inside refused panic. Instead, they rotated crews to maintain energy. Musketeers fired from ruined embrasures. Crossbowmen shot bolts into smoke. Cannoneers gamely repositioned small guns to answer the Turkish batteries, even knowing their iron balls were tiny compared to the Ottoman giants. Throughout the day, Ottoman troops tested the defenses. Janissaries advanced within trench networks, firing as they moved. Ottoman snipers picked off knights who dared expose themselves for even a second on the ramparts. Defenders dragged corpses inside, so the sight of fallen brothers would not weaken morale. At noon, the sky darkened from artillery smoke, turning the sun into a dull blood-red smudge behind clouds of ash. It felt less like Earth and more like purgatory. What stunned the Ottomans most was not Maltese courage, but Maltese endurance. St. Elmo's defenders refused to abandon forward bastions, even as walls collapsed beneath their feet. They rebuilt parapets under bombardment. They fought fire with buckets of seawater hauled up the rock face by rope. They operated cannon until barrels glowed red. Still, the situation worsened. By evening, the entire northwest wall had crumbled into rubble. Ottoman engineers cheered, shouting that the fort would fall tomorrow. Yet the knights formed new inner barricades, laying planks and stone blocks into makeshift defenses. They constructed a jagged, killing ground full of sharpened stakes, iron spikes, and upturned planks ready to break ankles. The fort shrank in size, but not in spirit. Mustafa expected surrender. Instead, he saw banners raised high. Torches lit the battlements. Priests held mass on shattered stone floors. Soldiers swore oaths to hold until death. In Valette, across the harbor, prepared reinforcements in secret. Fort St. Elmo was bleeding, but it lived, and its defenders promised the Ottomans would pay for every inch in blood. From the moment the first artillery volleys slammed into Fort St. Elmo, spreading dust clouds across the battlements and snatching breath from every man within its trembling walls, something changed in the hearts of the defenders. Pain became routine, exhaustion became constant, and fear, once whispered like a ghost, became a silent companion that nobody had time to acknowledge. What would have broken a lesser army shaped these knights into something terrifyingly resolute. As the bombardment continued day after day, every stone that fell seemed to feed their determination rather than drain it. They believed that their sacrifice was larger than their bodies, larger than the island, larger even than the order itself. They believed that history was watching them. They wanted to be remembered. Inside the ruined courtyard of St. Elmo, knights knelt among shattered masonry and prayed. Their armor, once polished, now glimmered with soot and ash. Their faces blackened like coal from the smoke of burning gunpowder. Many were injured, faces bandaged, arms slung in makeshift splints, legs trembling from blood loss, but they refused to retire. The wounded became soldiers again as soon as they could stand. Some asked comrades to tie weapons to their wrists because their fingers no longer held grip. Surgeons, working under torchlight inside cramped stone rooms, amputated shattered limbs while men recited prayers through clenched teeth. During the brief hours when the artillery paused, usually at night, when crews rested, the knights poured out of the inner yard to rebuild. They hauled stones across the ruins, stacking them into crude replacement barriers. Walls barely waist-high, but enough to slow an enemy charge. They hammered wooden beams into the ground to create new parapets. They dragged cannons into different positions, carefully adjusting their angle to target Ottoman trenches creeping closer like serpents through the earth. Their movements were silent except for the occasional grunt or whispered command. Nobody wanted to speak loudly, for the silence of night carried too much meaning. Water became a lifeline, and every drop was precious. Inside the fort, wells were shallow, and the bombardment threatened to fill them with rubble. Because Malta's heat was merciless, every night felt thirst like a knife inside the throat. Some men drank water tinged with blood or dirt. Yet even this seemed unimportant compared to the massive threat waiting across the battlefield. Food became equally scarce. Bread hardened into stone, meat spoiled quickly in humid heat, and rations had to be shared with malnourished militia members who fought beside noble knights with the same hunger for survival. Despite terrible strain, morale did not collapse. One reason was faith. Priests, wearing armor beneath their robes, walked across rubble-strewn pathways, offering last rites, communion, and emotional strength. They reminded the men that dying here meant salvation, not defeat. These priests were not passive observers. They carried swords, loaded muskets, and fired cannons alongside soldiers. Their presence made men feel watched by God, protected by heaven, even as hell unfolded around them. Another reason morale held was leadership. Valette, across the harbor, sent nightly reinforcements by boat, small groups of knights and volunteers crossing dark waters under fire. Some boats sank from musket volleys, vanishing into black waves without a sound. Others drifted back, carrying wounded men who refused to leave their comrades, but were too broken to continue. When new arrivals stepped inside St. Elmo, they did not complain about its ruined state or the smell of smoke and blood. They saluted the commander, kissed holy icons, and took positions along the shattered walls. Each replacement knew he had likely signed his own death sentence. Yet every position was filled quickly. The Maltese militia, though less armored than the knights, proved fearless. They were islanders who had grown up seeing storms batter cliffs and droughts kill crops, so endurance was already etched into their bones. Many wielded spears instead of swords, axes instead of shields, knives instead of sabers. Their hands were calloused, their skins sunburned, and their eyes steel-hard. To them, this battle was not about vows or symbols. It was about family. They fought because they knew what Ottoman slavery would mean to their children. Each day the sun rose into skies thick with haze, and each day the defenders whispered the same vow. Not today. St. Elmo does not die today. Across the harbor, beneath billowing red banners and smoking cannon lines, Ottoman commanders watched Fort St. Elmo refuse to collapse and found their confidence fading into irritation, then anger. When Mustafa and Piali had first surveyed their artillery batteries, they believed their cannons would turn St. Elmo to dust in less than a week. They had brought siege guns powerful enough to pulverize castles across Europe and Asia. They had galleys positioned to attack from sea. They had thousands of janissaries, masters of musket fire and disciplined infantry assault. They had elite corsairs hardened by decades of naval warfare. They had ample food and water, cool shade tents, medical tents supplied with instruments and herbs, and enough manpower to rotate troops constantly. Yet St. Elmo continued to exist. What frustrated the Ottomans most was the unnatural perseverance of their enemy. Scouts reported that even when entire wall faces collapsed, the defenders merely retreated to inner chambers, set up new barricades, and kept fighting. Every breach turned into a deadly trap. Janissaries attempting to charge through rubble found themselves ambushed by crossfire, grenades, and flaming pitch poured from broken parapets above. Ottoman bodies accumulated in collapsed trenches, and no matter how many hours they hurled gunfire at the walls, still the white cross flew. Another problem plagued Ottoman efforts: supply strain. The naval blockades made moving ammunition slower than expected. Cannon barrels overheated and warped under constant use. Powder crews reported shortages. Gun platforms had to be rebuilt because Malta's rock refused to hold steady under concussion stress. Crews dug dirt from hillside slopes to keep reinforcing their batteries, but the process exhausted even hardened workers. Meanwhile, heat crippled stamina. Ottoman soldiers were used to harsh climates, yet Malta's early summer sun drained strength from every man. Metal armor scorched skin, muskets burned to the touch, and wooden mantlets dried and cracked, leaving troops exposed. Fatigue made mistakes more common. Musketeers misfired, artillerymen dropped ammunition, officers shouted hoarse commands, and soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Corpses swelled in trenches, attracting insects and sickness. Rumors spread between units, dangerous, corrosive rumors. Some whispered that the knights had demons guarding them. Others said angels appeared on the ramparts at night. Still others feared that St. Elmo was a decoy fortress, meant to delay the Ottomans while European armies gathered nearby. The longer the fort held, the stronger superstition grew. Mustafa dismissed the stories publicly, but privately he cursed the delay. Every lost day weakened Ottoman dominance. His reports to Suleiman were turning embarrassing. The insignificant fort had become a symbol of defiance. Command tensions grew worse. Piali blamed Mustafa for reckless assaults and needless casualties. Mustafa accused Piali of cowardice for refusing to risk ships in closer bombardment range. Janissary captains argued that commanders underestimated knights. Even elite Corsair units muttered that without Dragut, the master strategist, they were being led blindly. The absence of Dragut weighed heavily on morale. Men looked to the horizon nightly for sails announcing his arrival. Ottoman doctors, though skilled, faced growing casualty numbers. Wounded soldiers lay in tents moaning through fever dreams. Amputations increased. The smell of sickness drifted into camp kitchens, ruining appetite. Despite these hardships, Ottoman pride prevented retreat. They had come too far, displayed too much power, and spent too much treasure to consider withdrawal. The empire's reputation stood at risk. If St. Elmo withstood their might, Europe would laugh. And Europe was watching. Across the sea, in Sicily and Rome, diplomats received letters describing St. Elmo's impossible survival. Artists sketched heroic images of knights standing atop rubble. Priests preached of miracles. The longer St. Elmo resisted, the louder Europe whispered that perhaps the Ottoman war machine was not invincible after all. Ottoman determination hardened. Every evening brought the terrifying question whispered among survivors: how are we still alive? Food rations shrank to crumbs and drops. Bread crumbled into dust. Wine barrels turned sour. Many men lived on shell fragments from dried figs or bits of salted fish, so aged it tasted like ash. Yet hunger was secondary to thirst. Malta's June sun, merciless and cloudless, baked the fort so thoroughly that water evaporated from barrels faster than it could be consumed. Lips cracked until they bled. Men hallucinated, reaching for mirages reflecting off scorched stone. Some defenders wrote farewell lines to family because they believed they would die not by sword or cannon, but by dehydration. Priests tried to bless rainwater collectors, but no showers came. Medical conditions deteriorated beyond description. Surgeons, working with dwindling supplies, amputated limbs with dull blades because their sharpest knives had worn into useless metal. Blood soaked into floors and never dried. Gangrene spread like a black vine through wounded flesh. Screams in surgery chambers echoed into sleeping quarters, robbing rest from exhausted soldiers. Even sleep, the only escape from war's noise, became rare because rats crawled across bodies searching for food scraps. Some rats died from drinking contaminated water near corpses. Others thrived, feeding on the dead. Their squealing became part of the nightly soundtrack. Yet through this horror, morale never collapsed. Defenders believed each breath they drew delayed Malta's destruction. Every hour they lived made Ottoman commanders enraged, confused, and fearful of reputation loss. They reminded each other that St. Elmo's death would inspire Sicily to act, inspire Europe to move, inspire Christendom to awaken from political paralysis. They said their survival mattered to thousands who were not here. Valette knew they could not live much longer. From St. Angelo, he watched time itself tear St. Elmo apart. But despite pleas from advisors, he refused to demand surrender. He believed ordering men to abandon the fort would dishonor everything they had already sacrificed. Some had died burned alive. Others had been blown apart. Hundreds lay buried beneath rubble, crushed beyond recognition. If Valette ended the fight too soon, he feared their ghosts would accuse him. The defenders understood their fate. They saw the fort collapse beneath them day by day. They counted walls still standing and found fewer each morning. They saw that the Ottomans had reached trenches close enough to toss grenades by hand. They knew that the crescent banner would soon rise above their heads. But rather than terror, they carried acceptance, duty, and almost curious peace. And still, St. Elmo held. What kept St. Elmo alive during its final days was not stone, iron, or even weaponry. It was human spirit bound together by faith, ritual, memory, and madness. Men devoted themselves to actions that, by military logic, should have ended weeks earlier. But logic no longer ruled the fort. Sacrifice did. Knights wrote letters as if each sentence preserved sanity. They carved messages into stone, into wood fragments, into scraps of burned parchment. Some addressed mothers, "Your son dies with honor." Others wrote to brothers promising vengeance. Some begged forgiveness for old sins. Others expressed joy at finally earning martyrdom. These letters, hidden in alcoves and pockets, would be found centuries later, silent testimonies to courage shaped at the edge of human endurance. Priests moved through rubble during artillery strikes, offering communion to soldiers whose mouths bled too much to swallow bread. They lifted crosses, knelt beside dying men, and whispered absolution into ears half-deaf from cannon fire. They blessed swords before charges, sang hymns while shells exploded overhead, and reassured broken soldiers that heaven awaited them beyond the smoke. Their own hands shook. Their own robes were soaked with blood. Some priests died mid-prayer, still clutching crucifixes. Others dragged wounded men to shelter even when they themselves needed medical care. Night brought rituals of farewell. Soldiers hugged each other without embarrassment. Veterans traded heirlooms, rings, medallions, lockets, daggers. They wanted their names to survive even if their bodies did not. Younger fighters begged older knights to tell legends of Rhodes or Jerusalem. Stories of the order's past glories gave them strength to face their own doom. There were moments of madness, too. A handful of defenders, driven to frenzy by starvation and sleeplessness, climbed onto broken battlements in broad daylight and shouted insults at the Ottoman lines, daring musketeers to shoot. Some danced mockingly under cannon fire, laughing like men who no longer believed in death. Others painted crosses in their own blood on their armor plates. Ottoman soldiers watching from trenches shook their heads, whispering that their enemies were possessed by angels or demons. As the fort shrank, defenders patched holes using impossible materials. They stacked corpses into wall breaks when stone ran out. They filled gaps with shattered weapons, loose armor, broken door frames, even tables and chairs ripped from storage rooms. At one point, a knight used his own shield as a masonry plug wedged into a cannon breech. When the fort received reinforcements by night, the newcomers stared in shock at what they saw. Most had to step around body parts to reach their stations. The psychological struggle was equally intense outside the fort. Ottoman soldiers, once confident, now feared St. Elmo like a living monster. They believed the knights were resurrecting at night, that killed enemies returned with dawn, that Malta's soil refused to accept Muslim blood. Some janissaries refused orders to charge trenches unless commanders whipped them. Mustafa cursed daily. Piali muttered about sorcery. Even Dragut's death seemed supernatural. Then came a moment that would be remembered for centuries. A message sent from the commanders of St. Elmo to Valette across the harbor. Its handwriting was shaky but clear. We understand we will die, but we ask no rescue. We ask only that cannon fire from St. Angelo never stops supporting our fight. We will hold until the last man falls. Valette wept reading the words, understanding that he was commanding martyrs, not soldiers. The following morning, the Ottomans launched their largest bombardment yet. The sky itself seemed to split open. Stones soared through air like flocks of deadly birds. The courtyard churned under iron impacts. But still St. Elmo answered with roaring defiance. The end, though near, would not be quiet. The last sunrise over St. Elmo arrived on June 23rd, 1565, but no one inside recognized dawn. The smoke was too thick, the sky too red, the air too heavy with disbelief. Ottoman cannons, now positioned for point-blank annihilation, unleashed continuous fire that pulverized the remaining walls. Battlements caved inward. Towers disintegrated. Staircases crumbled beneath feet. Yet the defenders did not flee. They assembled at every breach, sword and musket ready. Priests held crosses high. Captains roared commands across rubble. By mid-morning, Ottoman infantry surged forward. Thousands advanced. Drumbeats thundered. War cries echoed. Shields locked tight. Janissaries moved in tight formation, boots crunching rubble as if marching across gravel. Behind them came North African corsairs armed with scimitars and curved daggers, eager to carve revenge. The sheer weight of the assault shook the earth. The defenders answered with a final storm of gunfire. Arquebuses spat flame. Cannons dragged into strange positions, fired grape shot into charging ranks. Crossbow bolts pierced armor. Greek fire rained down, igniting clothing and flesh. Screams rose from the trenches. Men burned alive. Others, limbs severed, stumbled backward into their own comrades. Even so, the Ottomans continued forward, stepping over body piles, using corpses as cover. When the first wave reached the breaches, the fight turned intimate. Face to face, sword to sword, fist to jaw, knights swung broadswords with two hands, cleaving helmets apart. Maltese peasants stabbed with farming blades. Wounded soldiers crawled into battle, fighting on knees. Priests smashed skulls with candlesticks. Smoke blinded both sides, and the fort became a whirlpool of bodies slamming into one another. Ottoman numbers, however, were overwhelming. They poured through every gap. Defenders formed circles, protecting their banners. Cannons fell silent, not from lack of will, but lack of ammunition. Soldiers used rocks, wooden planks, and broken spear shafts. Some knights wielded their helmets as weapons. Blood slicked every surface. No one could stand without slipping. At last, the inner courtyard collapsed to Ottoman control. A handful of surviving knights retreated to the center, around the chapel altar, refusing surrender. They knelt briefly for blessing, then rose to die standing. The Ottomans respected neither surrender nor mercy. They killed everyone they found. Captured knights were tortured, mutilated, and beheaded out of rage for the weeks lost. Their bodies were displayed on crosses facing Burgu, a gruesome message for Valette. Yet the message backfired. Valette ordered Ottoman prisoners executed in retaliation. Malta roared with renewed hatred. The ladders went up, dozens of them, too many to knock down at once. Ottoman soldiers climbed by the hundreds, boots slipping on blood-soaked rungs, helmets flashing beneath cannon smoke. Maltese fighters at the parapets hurled logs, stones, sand, boiling water, burning pitch, axes, barrels filled with nails, and anything else they could lift. Some defenders simply leaned over and shoved ladders backward with their own bodies, falling to certain death with the enemy beneath them. Ottoman soldiers gained footholds. For 15 terrifying minutes, the top of Sanglia's sea wall became a whirlwind of blades and screams. Corsairs vaulted over battlements wielding scimitars. Knights countered with long swords and maces. Pikes jabbed eyes. Daggers slit throats. Musketeers fired at point-blank range, blasting holes the size of apples through skulls. Bodies tumbled into the sea below, splashes echoing between stone cliffs as wounded men drowned beneath armor weight. But the true crisis came at the pontoon. Ottoman artillery had been hammering the wooden bridge all morning, slowly cracking planks and severing chain lines. Water seeped through widening seams. Maltese carpenters hurled themselves onto the bridge mid-battle to hammer nails and lash rope in place. One carpenter continued repairing with half his face missing from shrapnel. Another worked with 3 broken fingers, crying in pain but refusing to stop. The Ottomans knew success at the bridge meant the doom of Sanglia, so they sent their elite. Corsair swimmers armed with knives, approaching underwater to cut support lines. Defenders noticed only when the bridge lurched. Panic surged. If the bridge collapsed then and there, hundreds of soldiers trapped on Sanglia would be slaughtered. Valette had anticipated this possibility. He had hidden archers beneath the bridge platform for this exact moment. As Ottoman swimmers surfaced for air, arrows pierced them from below. Bodies bobbed up bloodied. The survivors fled underwater, but chains secured the bridge supports further out. The attack failed. Still, Sanglia nearly yielded to the ladder surge. At one critical stretch, 30 Janissaries stood atop the parapet at once. They raised Ottoman banners and shouted victory. People inside Sanglia cried out in horror. Some defenders faltered. But then came the moment remembered forever. A group of Maltese fishermen, unarmored, barefoot, wearing nothing but torn trousers, picked up pikes from dead soldiers and charged the wall stairs screaming at the top of their lungs. Their attack shocked the Janissaries, who did not expect civilians. The fishermen stabbed through armor, tackled men off walls, and pushed multiple ladders into the sea using nothing but shoulder force. Sunglia roared in triumph. The Ottoman ladder assault collapsed. By sunset, exhausted Ottoman troops withdrew to trenches, dragging wounded men by rope or carrying them in blood-slick blankets. Sunglia defenders stood trembling, unable to lift arms from exhaustion. The pontoon held by miracle. The walls still stood, though torn ragged. Then, as night swallowed Malta, both sides looked across the water at flickering torches and realized the truth. This siege had crossed a threshold. The war was no longer about territory. It had become a contest to see which sides could survive inside fire. Sunglia and Burgos still lived, but barely, and tomorrow would be worse. The night following the 7 attacks was unlike any other in the entire siege. Both sides lay shattered in fatigue and disbelief. The Ottomans shocked that Malta had not collapsed, and the Maltese stunned that they themselves were still breathing. Yet where exhaustion might have ended movement, Valette instead ordered Burgu and Sunglia to rise and continue working. There would be no celebration, because the knights knew that the Ottomans would return with even greater fury. Every man and woman in Malta understood that what had happened today was not the climax. It was merely the storm crest. The worst still waited. Inside Sunglia, the wounded lay packed so densely inside chapel rooms that priests struggled to move between them. Torches flickered, illuminating lines of pale faces streaked with dirt and dried blood. Men missing limbs lay beside men whose armor had melted into their skin from pitch or fire. The smell was unbearable. Infection, sweat, vomit, burnt cloth, human waste, and rotting seaweed from clothing soaked in seawater. Yet no one complained. Many could not even speak. Some wrote last letters to family members who would never see them again. Others whispered final confessions to passing priests who knelt in dark corners and held dying hands. Still outside, the streets did not stay quiet. Hundreds of surviving defenders began repairing walls that had been torn apart hours earlier. Under torchlight that made the world swim in red and gold, men hauled beams into the Porto Torre breach. They hammered nails, wedged planks, dragged stone wheels, and stacked shattered limestone blocks. They worked with trembling fingers. Women carried water and mixed mortar with small cups, working beside their children. The work was frantic, exhausting, and hopelessly slow, but it was happening. Valette moved among the workers like a ghost in armor. His presence alone changed everything. When men saw him, they straightened their backs and struck harder. It was not obedience rooted in fear, but in awe. Here stood a man over 70 years old who refused sleep, who refused food until his men ate, who refused retreat even when staring at ruin. A man who bled with them. A man who demanded God take him before Malta fell. In the history of warfare, leadership of this magnitude appears in rare flashes, and Malta possessed such a leader when it needed him most. Along Sanglia's walls, bodies were still being removed from ladders and trenches. Soldiers had to pry corpses apart to clear space. Some bodies fell stiffly to the ground when armor was shifted. Others broke apart. Bones fractured from impacts nobody saw. The tide washed against Sanglia's sea walls, carrying blood into the harbor. Under torchlight, the water glimmered crimson. War, even without cannon fire, refused sleep. In Burgu, the tunneling threat continued. The defenders still heard faint scraping sounds beneath the city. Ottoman sappers had not abandoned their subterranean assault. Maltese engineers dug rapidly to intercept. At times they broke into Ottoman tunnels and fought in total darkness. Men stabbed blindly at unseen shapes in blackness. Some fights ended in silence, both sides too injured to move or speak. When the tunnels collapsed, dirt filled mouths, noses, and lungs, suffocating soldiers from both armies. Their bodies remained sealed inside the earth forever. Meanwhile, surgeons labored endlessly. They amputated limbs using saws heated in flames for sterilization. Patients screamed until voices collapsed. Surgeons stitched skin with horsehair thread. They poured wine into wounds as antiseptic. They reset bones by snapping them into place. Many patients died during operations, but each attempt mattered. A saved man meant another sword or musket on the walls. Malta had no luxury of losing fighters. Priests walked the night holding relics. Women knelt along corridors whispering psalms. Babies cried somewhere underground. The siege had twisted the city into an enormous hospital, cemetery, battlefield, and church all at once. Across the harbor, the Ottoman camp buzzed with furious activity. Though devastated by casualties, Mustafa refused to allow rest. He ordered fresh artillery positioning and demanded soldiers prepare to renew the breach attack at dawn. Ottoman imams preached that martyrdom awaited them inside Burgu. Officers beat drums, try to rebuild morale. Janissaries sharpened scimitars around low fires, muttering angrily about Valette, calling him a demon, a sorcerer, a madman. Corsairs drank in silence, staring at the sea that had betrayed them weeks earlier. The Ottoman wounded moaned in their tents, limbs missing, eyes blinded by Maltese quicklime. Their surgeons, though skilled, lacked the resources Malta stole from them through attrition. Muslim graves filled trenches outside camp. The empire bled, and still, both sides prepared to kill one another again at sunrise. Malta did not sleep. The Ottomans did not sleep. History paused, watching in silence. Though Mustafa boasted confidence publicly, the truth beneath his command canopy was far darker. Ottoman morale was collapsing under relentless psychological pressure. The empire had marched into Malta expecting glory and swift victory, believing that an island of knights could not possibly withstand the greatest war machine of the age. After months of fighting, the opposite had happened. St. Elmo had taken nearly a month to capture, costing thousands of elite troops. The naval assault at Sunlia had ended in fiery catastrophe. The 7 attacks, meant to break Malta, had achieved nothing but ash and bodies. Ottoman soldiers whispered that fate had turned against them. Many claimed strange signs appeared in the night sky. Red stars streaking above Sunlia and halos around the moon. Some believed the island itself hated them, pointing to dust storms that blew gunpowder into the harbor and summer heat that killed men where they stood. There were mutterings that Dragut's death had cursed the camp. Ottoman commanders tried to silence these ideas, but fear slithered through trenches like smoke from extinguished torches. Supplies worsened morale. Food stocks spoiled in the heat. Bread turned moldy. Meat rotted black around the edges. Water warmed in barrels, breeding sickness. Soldiers drank anyway, vomiting hours later. The medical tents overflowed with dysentery victims. Flies swarmed everywhere. Corpses piled faster than burial crews could dig. Wolves and wild dogs crept near camp at night, feeding off abandoned bodies. Men woke screaming from nightmares, imagining claws tearing flesh. Worse still, pay had stopped. Ottoman soldiers were promised enormous wealth for taking Malta: slaves, silver, Christian treasures, armor, land, even titles. Now, many held nothing but disease and scars. Piali Pasha still blamed Mustafa for every setback. Mustafa still cursed Piali for cowardice at sea. Their rivalry poisoned leadership. Officers beneath them copied this division, splitting into factions. Some swore loyalty to Mustafa, some to Piali, some simply wanted to survive. Janissaries, once feared for discipline, began speaking openly against commanders. They hated trench conditions. They hated being forced to repeat assaults on walls that refused to fall. They hated dying for land that did not exist under their feet. A Janissary captain confronted Mustafa days after the 7 attacks and demanded answers. How many more shall we throw into the pit? Mustafa nearly executed him, but refrained. He needed every fighting body alive. Ottoman manpower did not dwindle only through battle. It evaporated through desertion. Some mercenaries fled the camp at night, attempting to swim across the harbor towards St. Angelo. Almost all drowned or were shot trying. Still, their attempts symbolized desperation. Others pretended sickness to avoid combat. Some lay down in trenches, claiming leg injuries. Turkish officers beat them until they stood, but whispers lingered. There was one more psychological weight. Malta's defenders fought like men ready to die. Ottomans watched knights laugh under bombardment. They saw women carrying stones while shells exploded overhead. They heard church bells ringing louder than cannon blasts. They watched wounded men on Sanlia climb parapets with missing limbs and fight with knives held between teeth. They could not understand such madness. Many believed the knights were possessed, not by God, but by insanity bred from martyrdom dreams. Ottoman leadership feared time itself now. Every day spent at Malta increased the chance of Sicilian invasion. Every week eroded supply. Every night infected morale deeper. Rumors of Christian reinforcements arriving grew louder. Mustafa ignored them publicly. Yet at night, he paced alone, sleepless, staring toward the north where Sicilian ships might appear at any moment. Even the weather opposed them. Sudden storms filled trenches with water, drowning equipment and collapsing earthworks. Lightning struck a powder magazine, killing dozens. Heat waves roasted men in armor. In the past, the empire would have retreated to regroup. But Malta had become a matter of legacy. Suleiman demanded victory. The empire demanded victory. Mustafa's pride demanded victory. So the Ottomans pushed forward. Yet their hearts trembled. Valette, recognizing Ottoman morale collapse beginning to show, made a shocking decision. Malta would no longer simply withstand the siege. Malta would attack. This idea sounded absurd to some commanders. How could starving, exhausted defenders leave their walls to strike the greatest military in the world? But Valette knew siege warfare. Psychological trauma could break armies faster than gunpowder. So he ordered countermeasures none expected. First, he unleashed shock raids. Small groups of elite knights and Maltese militia crossed trenches at night, attacking Ottoman outposts with knives and torches. They slit throats silently, burned munition stacks, overturned water barrels, stole tools, and killed isolated engineers. Sometimes they dragged corpses back to Burgu to demoralize troops watching across trenches. Ottoman soldiers awoke to screams and chaos, discovering comrades gutted in their tents. Such raids terrified men more deeply than cannon fire. Death from darkness felt supernatural. Second, Valette ordered cannon crews to fire at random intervals through the night, denying Ottoman soldiers rest. The thunder never stopped. Men in trenches began hallucinating explosions during silence. Sleep became impossible. Dreams turned into nightmares of St. Elmo's fallen garrison clawing through soil. Third, Valette used propaganda. He spread rumors through captured prisoners that a massive Sicilian relief force was already sailing to Malta. Ottomans panicked quietly, though commanders denied news. Still, whispers circulated that 15,000 Spanish troops were marching to Malta, which was false, but fear gave the rumor strength. Fourth, Valette altered rotation schedules. Instead of letting defenders remain at the same wall, he moved units constantly, making the city seem far more populated than reality. Ottoman spies miscalculated numbers, believing Malta had triple its actual strength. The illusion mattered. At times, the repair crew had to flatten themselves against stone to avoid direct hits. Some were killed while repairing the very walls meant to protect them. The defenders joked bitterly that Burgu's walls were being built and destroyed at the same time. Yet the walls were not the only things breaking. Streets began to crumble beneath bombardment pressure. Roof tiles shattered. Churches shivered under artillery waves. Walls inside homes cracked open like eggshells. Families tried to sleep in basements or cellars, fearing that ceilings would collapse upon them. Wells dried up from tremors, shifting underground rock layers. Some wells collapsed entirely, sucking in soil and creating pits deep enough to swallow cattle. Food stores cracked open, spilling grain into dust and dirt. The city felt like a living thing being crushed slowly beneath a giant's hands. Inside houses, people whispered fears they did not dare speak aloud during daylight, that the walls would fall so completely the defenders would be forced to battle in the streets. Maltese mothers tucked children beneath beds and prayed that the Ottomans would never reach the city center. Men, hardened fishermen and farmers before the siege, now slept with pikes beside them, knowing their own front doors could become last battle lines. Priests warned parishioners that the true test had not yet begun. Meanwhile, on the Ottoman side, confidence surged as they watched Burgu disintegrate. They believed time itself was now a weapon for them, grinding Malta down inch by inch. Ottoman commanders inspected their trenches and batteries and concluded that a decisive breach was imminent. Mustafa ordered intensified bombardment. More shot, more powder, more noise. He wanted Burgu to drown not only in rubble, but in despair. Ottoman drums pounded constantly, not only to signal orders to troops, but to psychologically suffocate Malta. The sound traveled across the water like a pulse, day and night, crawling into people's minds and dreams. Malta responded with its own heartbeat, church bells. Priests refused to stay silent. They rang bells at every sunrise, at every mass, and during every moment when defenders returned wounded from walls. Bells echoed defiantly across the harbor. The sound startled Ottoman soldiers, who had never fought an enemy that answered artillery thunder with songs of faith. Still, as days passed, walls continued to break. At the Castile bastion, cracks expanded from fist-sized to arm-sized. Stones that once required cranes to lift fell away under their own weight. A deep fissure developed along the main entry staircase leading up the interior parapet. Each time defenders marched across it, dust puffed upward like a warning breath. Behind work crews, wounded knights lay in rows on bedrolls, watching the walls crumble, their faces etched with rage and pride. And yet, none of this broke Malta. Every collapse brought new strategy. Every gap gave birth to innovation. Where walls thinned, barricades thickened. Where parapets fell, trench lines emerged. Where artillery pierced stone, defenders bent steel. The siege was no longer only about stone. It was now about unstoppable human will. If the Ottomans wanted Burgu, they would need to carve it out by hand. As the siege intensified, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette revealed depths of leadership that even his closest allies had never imagined. Though 71 years old, he walked the battlements every day, not in ornate robes or symbolic armor, but in practical chainmail, holding his own sword, speaking to soldiers face to face. He spoke to men by name, asked about their injuries, listened to their fears, and encouraged them with the calm certainty of someone who did not merely believe in victory. He demanded it from fate itself. Valette enforced discipline with steel. When officers suggested retreating from exposed sections of Burgu to avoid needless casualties, Valette thundered back, "We do not retreat. We do not surrender a stone. If Burgu falls, Christendom follows." This stubbornness shocked some commanders. Many had assumed that if walls broke badly enough, the order would fall back to St. Angelo and fight from that inner fortress. But Valette crushed this fantasy instantly. He argued that if Burgu fell even partially, Ottoman forces would gain artillery position within the city, making St. Angelo impossible to hold. Retreat, he insisted, was death disguised as common sense. To instill this doctrine, Valette issued brutal policy. Any soldier caught abandoning his post without direct order would be executed. The rule applied to knights, militia, civilians, everyone. Several terrified Maltese militiamen wavered during an Ottoman push and retreated into a street. Valette personally chased them, sword drawn, and forced them back to the wall. The men obeyed and survived that day. The message spread across the city like lightning. Valette would kill his own cowards before letting Ottomans do it. But Valette was not merely harsh, he was inspiring. He shared meals with the rank and file. He refused special rations. He refused private bedding. He slept on stone floors in the council hall, armor still on. One night, after a brutal artillery storm, Valette visited survivors in a makeshift hospital inside a church crypt. He knelt beside each wounded man, touching their foreheads, whispering prayers. Some soldiers sobbed when they saw their commander kneeling before them. A Spanish knight wrote later that Valette's presence, turned pain into fire and doubt into steel. The Grand Master's refusal to show fear became legendary. During one heavy bombardment, a cannonball smashed a parapet not 6 paces from Valette, blowing stone everywhere. Knights shouted for him to retreat. He remained standing, cloak flapping in dust, watching calmly as workers filled the crater. His message was undeniable. Malta would not bend, so he would not either. Valette's leadership extended beyond morale. He was a master tactician. He rotated men constantly, so no brigade remained too long at the worst walls. He redistributed ammunition to ensure no cannon went dry. He sent spies into Ottoman trenches, disguised as dead bodies, to collect information. He even ordered psychological tricks. During quiet nights, defenders shouted insults at Ottoman trenches, describing incoming Christian reinforcements in elaborate detail to spread anxiety. Yet the greatest moment of Valette's defiance came when his officers proposed abandoning vulnerable front walls and falling back to deeper lines. Valette slammed his fist on the council table. We do not give walls. Walls defend us only when we defend them. Stone is nothing without blood. He argued that Malta's reality left no room for layered retreats. This was the last line. There were no deeper walls. There was only victory or annihilation. His commanders accepted the truth, even as they feared it. Below leadership and strategy, Valette carried personal anguish. Every morning, he saw the casualty lists, hundreds of names, some knights he had known since youth. Every night, he heard wounded men screaming below the council chamber. He pressed palms together and prayed for hours. His prayers were not for deliverance, but endurance. Lord, give us one more day. And one more day always came. His example ignited Malta into unified rage. Civilians walking past him stood straighter. Children saluted him in the streets. Wounded men begged to return to the walls if they could still crawl. The moon drifted across the sky like a ghost. Beneath it, Malta fought not only for survival, but for identity. The defenders understood they were living through a chapter history would recite forever. The Ottomans understood they were fighting enemies who refused logic, refused terror, refused death itself. When dawn arrived, both armies looked at each other across the battlefield trenches, blood still wet on stone, weapons slick with dried sweat, and realized something chilling. The entire identity of Malta became tied to Valette's unbreakable presence. The Ottomans saw this and hated him for it. Amid all the destruction, the people of Malta continued living, not just surviving, but expressing humanity in defiance of war. Their gestures, conversations, and rituals formed a tapestry of resilience more remarkable than any military maneuver. Inside Berga's most intact church, a priest began painting tiny crosses onto the foreheads of every child each morning. He promised them that these marks would remind God where they belonged if death came. Some children refused to wash their faces afterward, believing the blessing protected them like armor. When Ottoman shells shattered the church roof, killing the priest, others continued marking the symbols themselves with charcoal. In homes reduced to rubble heaps, families gathered in corners to sing lullabies. Women used linen scraps to wrap bread to hide its dryness from children. Some turned shredded curtains into slings for carrying water buckets. Maltese mothers told stories of saints walking through fire unharmed, and children repeated the tales like battle chants. Fear remained thick, but beneath it pulsed resilience. There was humor too, dark humor born from madness. After a cannonball crashed into a house and rolled across the kitchen floor without exploding, its owner reportedly sat on it, declaring, "If the Turks wish to join us for supper, let them knock first." Laughter rippled across the walls when soldiers overheard the story. Faces, though grimy and exhausted, showed loyalty. Soldiers shared rations so no man starved. Women tore their own clothing to bind wounds. Old fishermen, unable to fight, became water runners, risking their lives crossing open squares carrying buckets for defenders. Then came one of the most astonishing events of the siege, a wedding. A young Maltese couple, convinced they would die soon, asked Valette's blessing to marry before battle claimed them. The Grand Master agreed. The bride wore burned silk scraps, the groom a patched vest soaked in sweat. Hundreds gathered around them in a cratered courtyard, artillery booming overhead. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, voices raised in cheers that drowned out cannon blasts. The Ottomans heard the roar and believed perhaps Malta celebrated reinforcements. In truth, Malta celebrated love inside death's mouth. And through it all, wounded men returned to duty in numbers that shocked Ottoman observers. One knight fought with his arm missing from the elbow down. Another defended Singlia wearing half armor because the other half had melted onto his skin. Maltese militia, their backs scarred from shrapnel, climbed walls laughing at pain. Ottoman sharpshooters began saying they were firing at ghosts. Inside the Ottoman camp, psychological pressure shifted. Soldiers wondered how Malta still fought without water, food, and sleep. They feared Malta possessed supernatural favor. Janissaries whispered that angels fought beside the knights. Some even claimed the sea wind sang Christian hymns at night. Through every horror, one truth echoed louder than all bombardment. Malta would not die quietly. It would not surrender its humanity. It would laugh, love, sing, and pray even on the edge of ruin. And the Ottomans knew, if they wanted Burgu, they would have to drown that human spirit in blood. After the repelled naval attack and the failed land assault, the Ottomans realized Singlia had become a thorn buried so deep into their military pride that they could not leave it alone, not even for a single hour. So, they turned Singlia into a focal point of relentless bombardment. Day after day, cannon blasts tore through its streets, collapsing roofs and shredding support beams. Smoke hovered above the peninsula like a shroud. Stone dust filled the air so completely at times that defenders could not see their own hands extended before them. The harbor wind, once a comfort, now became enemy ally, blowing smoke and grit into eyes already swollen from sleeplessness. On Sanglia's sea-facing walls, the defenders continued to stare across the water at Ottoman artillery batteries positioned on Mount Sybaris. These guns, originally directed at Fort St. Angelo, now rotated to blast Singlia directly. The peninsula trembled. Cannons belched fire. Their recoil shook the rock beneath them. Even thick bastions, designed as masterpieces of Renaissance architecture, began to crack. Engineers shoved iron bars into widening seams. Children carried buckets of wet clay to reinforce interior walls. Women wrapped rope around structural posts to prevent collapse. They all moved as if trying to hold back an earthquake with bare hands. Inside homes, daily life became grotesquely simple. Survive the next hour. A family might wake to the sound of cannon fire shaking furniture across the room. Parents would drag children to corners away from windows. They would pray. They would wait. Minutes later, another barrage would rip across rooftops, ceiling beams dropping dust on a hair, stone chunks bouncing off floors. Mothers bent over babies, so falling rubble crushed their backs rather than small bodies beneath. Some died protecting their children. Those children became orphans inside cities that no longer resembled cities at all. The defenders felt time dissolve. Night and day blurred into a rhythm of explosions and rebuilding. They stopped counting weeks. They stopped counting days. They stopped sleeping. When brief silence came between firing intervals, soldiers collapsed against walls and slept with rifles across their knees, dreaming of blood and fire. When they awoke, they resumed fighting without complaint. Singlia became a world where survival was not measured in victories or losses. It was measured in breaths drawn between cannon blasts. Valette ordered constant rotation of troops between Burgu and Singlia to prevent units from collapsing under stress. Knights from Castile switched positions with Long of Aragon. German mercenaries guarded staircases while Spanish swordsmen patrolled ramparts. Maltese militia plugged gaps everywhere else. Language no longer mattered. The siege created its own tongue. Gestures, shouts, oaths, prayers, screams. Men shouted instructions through dust clouds so thick that even sound struggled to pass. Ottoman sharpshooters positioned along the trenches used Sanglia's damaged rooftops for target practice. They fired at any silhouette, soldier, woman, priest. Several defenders devised strange methods to survive, holding shields above their heads while walking, crawling on all fours from one wall to another, using broken furniture as mobile barricades. But sharpshooters adapted. They learned to predict movement. Every new strategy became obsolete quickly. Death found patterns. Siege warfare was as much deception as force. But the most shocking counterstrike occurred near the pontoon bridge at Sanglia 2 nights after the 7 attacks. Valette ordered a secret demolition team to swim beneath Ottoman siege barges at night. Armed with crude hand drills, they bored holes into hulls. At dawn, when Ottomans attempted another naval harassment maneuver, 3 barges sank instantly, drowning dozens. Ottoman sailors went mad with fear, convinced demons dragged ships downward. In Burgu, defenders shouted insults across trenches, singing loudly, "We are still here. We have more blood than you have bullets. Come again and drown on our rocks." Maltese children even carved wooden crescent moons and hurled them into enemy trenches, mocking the Ottoman symbol. Mustafa boiled with rage. He ordered double pay for volunteers to storm Burgu's walls again. Few stepped forward. What Valette knew, and what Mustafa did not accept, was that the siege had turned. The mathematical logic of warfare now favored Malta. Ottoman ammunition stores were fading. Their manpower could not be replaced. Their morale could not be rebuilt. Their health could not be restored. Meanwhile, every additional day, Malta survived brought Sicilian aid closer. The siege now resembled a collapsing tower. Every stone shaken, every support weakening, every hour counted. But victory remained far away. Malta had reached a point where strength no longer came from muscle, but from soul. Ottomans still had tens of thousands of troops. The city walls were still rupturing. Winter would bring storms capable of killing everyone. And the final Ottoman plan, one more colossal assault, was already forming in Mustafa's mind. Malta would survive only if it endured one last unimaginable storm. Valette often crossed the pontoon bridge connecting Sanglia to Burgu, wearing full armor, carrying no shield, daring enemy gunners to aim at him. The men who witnessed this said the sight alone was enough to crumble despair and rebuild morale. But it was risky. Arrows fired at him regularly. One bolt struck his helmet and bounced off. Valette joked afterward that God had a better aim than the Ottomans. Civilians were trapped within Sanglia's walls. Every alley housed wounded. Every cellar stored bodies wrapped in cloth, waiting for burial impossible under fire. Some bodies decayed inside houses, covered with blankets, because funerals were too dangerous. The smell of rot and burned gunpowder mixed into a stench no one would ever forget. Ottoman musicians, stationed across the water, played war music to intimidate the defenders. Drums pounded, horns sounded, voices chanted Muslim battle verses. The knights listened, unmoved. They answered back with church hymns, sung loudly enough to echo across battered stone. The result was a surreal mixture of chants, Islamic and Christian, clashing in the air like rival storms. Then a strange rumor spread. Some defenders claimed they saw visions on Sanglia's shattered walls. A Maltese soldier swore he saw the ghost of Saint Elmo walking across battlements, flames dancing around him. Another said he heard voices speaking Latin from the sea. Ottoman soldiers claimed to hear angels chanting above Sanglia. Whether hallucination or hope, these visions fed morale. They reminded both sides that more than territory was at stake. Identity, faith, and destiny were bound into the stones they fought over. And Sanglia did not fall. Not yet. While Sanglia endured bombardment, Burgu faced a different nightmare, the Porto Torre breach. Porto Torre, located along the city's waterfront walls, had always been seen as less exposed to heavy artillery. Sanglia fared no differently. The peninsula became a cloud. Houses collapsed inward, windows shattered by shock waves. Hospital ceilings rained plaster onto wounded men lying helpless beneath. A surgeon's knife clattered across floor as he was thrown forward by concussion blast. Blood from operating tables splashed everywhere. And still, Ottomans fired. Mustafa had ordered his entire artillery reserve used in one morning. They burned through powder like water through fingers. Gun crews collapsed from heat, but were dragged upright by captains screaming at them to continue. The barrels of their largest cannons glowed red-hot. Metal warped. Wheels cracked. But Mustafa did not care. He wanted Malta erased. At the Porto Torre breach, the bombardment finally achieved what months of shelling had not. The lower supporting wall behind rubble split open, revealing inner city interior. A second breach existed now, wide, raw, lethal. Ottoman soldiers cheered wildly. In Castile, parapet sections fell completely, killing dozens instantly. But Malta did not break. Even under bombardment, so violent that many defenders vomited from disorientation, Valette refused retreat. He sprinted across Burgos streets, screaming orders that somehow pierced through thunder. Repair the breach. Reinforce Castile. Cover the guns. Men obeyed. In the middle of cannon barrage, defenders ran into rubble dust, dragging timbers across streets to block the new breach opening. They shoved sandbags into gaps. They hammered nails through wood with bare fists when hammers were lost. They worked through collapsing fire, choking dust, and falling stone. Ottoman officers watched in disbelief. They had just broken city walls that should have doomed Malta, and the Maltese were rebuilding them under cannon fire. After 6 hours, Mustafa ended bombardment. Not because city fell, but because his barrels risked exploding.